Some stories touch the soul and stay with us forever. Subscribe and join us on this journey full of emotions and memories. At 92 years old, Eleanor knew her time was slipping away. Her frail body lay beneath the soft quilt she had always loved, a blanket she had stitched with memories of the family she adored. Beside her, clutching her hand, sat Emily, her 50-year-old daughter, trying hard to mask the tears brimming in her eyes. Emily's knuckles were white from the grip, as if holding on tightly could somehow keep Eleanor from leaving. The room was dimly lit by the golden light of the late afternoon sun seeping through the curtains, casting warm shadows on the wooden floor. The air was thick with silence, interrupted only by the faint wheezing of Eleanor's breath. Yet, there was one absence that weighed heavy in the room: Harold. Harold, Eleanor's husband of 70 years, was missing. The old man, now 89, had promised he would be there for her. He had taken a trip just 2 days earlier, against Emily's protests, determined to collect an old photograph from the attic of their summer home, a memento of the life they had shared. Emily had begged him to stay, warning that Eleanor's condition was critical, but Harold had insisted, saying, "I'll be back before she even notices I'm gone." But he wasn't back. And now, every second felt like an eternity. Eleanor's watery eyes drifted across the room, landing briefly on the empty doorway. Her heart ached, not from the illness that consumed her body, but from the missing presence of Harold, the man she had loved her entire life. She turned her gaze away, squeezing Emily's hand with what little strength she had left, as if apologizing for her helplessness. Just as Emily opened her mouth to say something, the door creaked open. The sound was small, but it was enough to make both women's hearts leap. There he was, Harold, standing in the doorway, a travel-worn man with a suitcase in hand. His face was marked with exhaustion, his eyes sunken, and his clothes wrinkled from the journey. But he was here. Harold shuffled slowly into the room, each step weighed down by the journey he had made, the regrets already forming in his mind. His hands trembled as they clutched the handle of his old leather suitcase, the one he had used for decades, now scuffed and worn like his own body. His breath hitched when he saw Eleanor lying there, so small, so fragile, her once vibrant smile now reduced to a faint curve, barely there at all. It felt like a lifetime since he had last seen her, though it had only been 2 days. 2 days that stretched into an eternity in his heart. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words knotted in his throat. His lips quivered as he placed the suitcase on the floor, the faint thud echoing through the stillness. His eyes, once sharp and filled with stubborn pride, were now clouded with a mix of guilt and sorrow. He had left her. He had promised her he would be there, and yet, in these crucial moments, he hadn't been. Emily glared at him from her mother's bedside. Her jaw tightened, her hands still wrapped protectively around Eleanor's fragile fingers. "You took too long, Dad," she whispered, her voice heavy with resentment. The accusation hung in the air like a blade. Harold staggered forward, ignoring the ache in his knees. I came back as fast as I could," he murmured, his voice cracking like brittle glass. "I didn't think—" But the words trailed off. What excuse could possibly matter now? He knew deep down that no journey, no reason, would be enough to make up for not being there when Eleanor needed him the most. Eleanor's gaze slowly drifted toward Harold. Her cloudy blue eyes, once so full of life and love, were now tired. Tired from the weight of years and the realization that time, that cruel thief, was finally running out. Yet, even in her exhaustion, her face softened. She had waited for him. She had held on for him. A weak, wavering smile crept onto her lips as she whispered, "You made it, Harold. You're here." Harold's chest tightened, the pain of her words slicing through him. He lowered himself slowly, painfully, to the side of the bed, his bones protesting with every movement. He reached out and covered Eleanor's hand with both of his, holding it as if she might slip away if he let go. He kissed her knuckles. Those delicate hands that had sewn his shirts, cradled their children, and comforted him through every storm of life. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to leave you alone." I didn't know it would be this fast." His words dissolved into a choked sob, the tears he had held back for years now spilling freely. Eleanor's hand, so thin it felt like paper, brushed against his cheek. "Hush, Harold," she murmured, her breath shallow. "You're here now. That's all that matters." Emily turned her head away, unable to watch her father weep so openly. She wanted to hate him for leaving, for being late, for not knowing how close they were to the end. But the truth was, she had seen the love between her parents for all her life. A love so fierce and enduring that even time itself couldn't erode it. And now, seeing Harold broken and vulnerable, she realized that no one could love Eleanor the way he did. Harold sat beside Eleanor, his mind drifting to the past. The summers they spent in their little lake house, Eleanor's laughter echoing through the trees, the nights they danced in the living room to old jazz records, and the way her hand had always found his in the dark. "I brought it," he said suddenly, his voice thick with emotion. He reached down and unzipped the old suitcase, pulling out a worn black and white photograph encased in a cracked frame. It was a picture of the two of them on their wedding day, young, foolish, and wildly in love. Eleanor's smile in that photo was the brightest thing he had ever seen, and he had spent 70 years chasing that light. He placed the photograph gently on Eleanor's lap, as if it were a precious relic. She smiled weakly, her fingers tracing the edges of the frame. "We were so young," she whispered. "And I'd marry you again," Harold replied softly. "Even now, even knowing all the heartache and mistakes. I'd do it all over again." Eleanor's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I waited for you, Harold," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "I was afraid I wouldn't get to say goodbye." Harold's heart shattered. "You're not going anywhere, Eleanor," he whispered fiercely, though he knew the truth deep down. They both did. Eleanor gave a small, sad smile. "I have to, my love, but it's okay. I'm not afraid anymore. I had everything I ever wanted. You and Emily. That's more than enough." Emily sobbed silently beside them, squeezing her mother's hand, as if the force of her love could keep her tethered to this world. But Eleanor's breaths were becoming slower, more labored. Each one felt like a struggle, as if her body knew it was time to let go, even if her heart wasn't ready. Harold leaned closer, his lips trembling as he whispered into her ear, "Wait for me, Eleanor. Wherever you go, wait for me. I'll find you. I promise." Eleanor's smile widened, the last remnants of life flickering in her eyes. "I'll be waiting," she whispered, her voice a soft promise carried on her final breath. Her hand went limp in Harold's grasp. The room plunged into silence, a silence so heavy it felt unbearable. Harold stared at Eleanor's lifeless face, his mind struggling to grasp the enormity of the moment. She was gone. The woman who had been his entire world for 70 years was gone. Emily reached out, wrapping her arms around her father, but Harold didn't move. He stayed frozen, clutching Eleanor's hand, as if he could still feel her warmth lingering there. And then, without warning, Harold stood up. He stumbled toward the window, his legs shaky but determined. "She's not gone," he muttered, almost to himself. "Not really. I can feel her. I can still feel her." Emily watched in stunned silence as her father opened the window, the cool evening breeze brushing against his wrinkled skin. He stood there for a moment, inhaling deeply, as if searching for Eleanor in the wind. "She's waiting," he whispered. Emily's heart clenched as she watched her father, a broken man still desperately clinging to the hope that love could transcend even death. Harold stood frozen by the window, the cool evening breeze brushing against his worn skin. His heart ached in ways he didn't know were possible. For 70 years, Eleanor had been his anchor, and now, without her, the world felt unsteady, like a boat adrift in a storm. He could feel her absence, as if a piece of his soul had been torn away. Emily stayed silent, watching her father with a mixture of sadness and fear. She had never seen him like this before, lost, vulnerable, and so utterly broken. "Dad," she whispered, stepping closer. "Come sit down, please." Harold didn't move. His gaze was locked on the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set, casting hues of orange and purple across the sky. "Do you see it?" he asked, his voice distant, almost childlike. Emily blinked. "See what, Dad?" "The light," Harold whispered. "It's just like the day we met. She's there. I know she is." Tears welled in Emily's eyes. She wanted to pull her father away from the window, to make him sit and rest, but something in his expression stopped her. It was the same look he had when he used to talk about Eleanor in their younger years, like a man utterly enchanted by the love of his life. Harold's knees buckled slightly, and Emily rushed to his side, guiding him back toward the bed where Eleanor lay, peaceful and still. Harold's fingers trembled as he reached out, brushing a lock of her silver hair behind her ear, just as he had done countless times before. She hated when her hair got in her eyes, he murmured with a sad smile. Emily sat beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder. "She held on for you, Dad. She wouldn't leave until she saw you again." Harold's breath hitched as he clutched Eleanor's hand, bringing it to his lips. "I should have been here sooner," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I wasted time. Stupid time, chasing memories when all I wanted was right here." Emily gave his shoulder a squeeze, her own heart breaking, as she watched the man she admired crumble under the weight of regret. "You were always with her, even when you weren't here," she said softly. "She knew that, Dad. She knew." Harold closed his eyes, letting the silence of the room settle over him. He thought about their life together, the laughter, the fights, the quiet mornings over coffee, and the way Eleanor used to dance in the kitchen when she thought no one was watching. Every moment they shared felt like a precious thread in the tapestry of their lives, now unraveling before him. "I remember the first time I saw her," Harold whispered, more to himself than to Emily. "She was standing by the lake, skipping stones. I knew right then I'd love her forever." Emily smiled through her tears. She had heard the story 100 times, but it never lost its magic. "And she knew you would, Dad. She never doubted it." Harold nodded, his eyes still locked on Eleanor's serene face. I thought we had more time." The weight of his words hung heavy in the room, a painful reminder that even the deepest love couldn't stop the relentless march of time. Harold leaned down, pressing a kiss to Eleanor's forehead. "Wait for me," he whispered. "Wherever you are, wait for me. I'll find you." Emily's chest tightened as she listened to her father's whispered promise. She knew that Harold's love for Eleanor went beyond this world, and somehow that gave her comfort. They had been two souls intertwined for a lifetime, and even death couldn't break that bond. Harold sat quietly for a moment, his fingers still intertwined with Eleanor's. The clock on the wall ticked softly, each second marking the passage of time that now felt meaningless without her. But in his heart, Harold knew that this wasn't the end. Not for them. "I'll be with you soon, Ellie," he whispered, using the nickname he had given her on their honeymoon. "Just wait for me a little longer." Emily helped Harold back to the chair by the window. He sat in silence, staring out at the night sky as the stars began to appear. For a moment, the world outside seemed impossibly large, yet Harold felt closer to Eleanor than ever. "I can feel her," he murmured, his voice filled with quiet certainty. "She's not gone, not really." Emily knelt beside him, resting her head on his arm. "I know, Dad," she whispered. "I feel her too." The two of them sat there, wrapped in the stillness of the night, as if waiting for a sign, a breeze, a whisper, anything to remind them that Eleanor was still with them in some way. And then, from the window, came the softest breeze, carrying the scent of lavender, the same scent Eleanor had worn every day of her life. Harold closed his eyes, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "She's waiting," he whispered. Emily smiled too, her heart aching but full of peace. She knew that one day her father would find Eleanor again, and until then, they would carry her memory with them in every breath, in every heartbeat. The night stretched on, and Harold stayed by the window, his thoughts drifting between the past and the future. Emily stayed by his side, holding his hand, knowing that this was just the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter where love endured beyond the boundaries of time. And though the story seemed to end here, in the quiet of the night, both Emily and Harold knew in their hearts that it wasn't truly over. There were still more moments to live, more memories to make, and one day, perhaps sooner than they imagined, Harold would find his way back to Eleanor. Because some stories never really end. They just wait for the next chapter to begin. Harold remained by the window, lost in thought, while the weight of the silence pressed heavily on his shoulders. Every moment without Eleanor felt unbearable. Time, which had once been their ally, was now an unforgiving thief. He turned slightly to glance at her lifeless form on the bed. Even in death, she looked beautiful, fragile, yes, but serene, as if she had simply drifted off into a dream. He imagined her somewhere far away, in a place where pain didn't exist, waiting patiently for him, as she had done so many times throughout their life. "I shouldn't be here without her," Harold whispered, almost to himself. Emily shifted beside him, still holding his hand. "You are, Dad, and I need you here with me. Please, don't drift away too." But Harold's mind was already slipping into memories, back to the moments that defined them as a family. He remembered the day Emily was born, how Eleanor had clutched his hand in the delivery room, squeezing with surprising strength despite her exhaustion. When the nurse handed baby Emily to them, Eleanor had looked at him with tears in her eyes and whispered, "Look what we made, Harold. Isn't she perfect?" He had nodded then, overwhelmed with love for both his daughter and the woman who made his life whole. And now, Emily sat beside him as a grown woman, holding his hand in the same way Eleanor had all those years ago. Life, he realized, was a circle, full of beginnings and endings, joy and sorrow, love and loss. Harold exhaled slowly, leaning back into the chair. "Do you remember, Emily, the time we went to the lake house? Your mom and I couldn't get the old boat to work, and you insisted we paddle out anyway, even though the water was freezing." Emily smiled, though tears welled up in her eyes again. "You two were terrible at paddling. We ended up going in circles the whole time." Harold chuckled, a deep, gravelly sound that seemed foreign after all the tears. "Your mom kept laughing so hard she nearly fell overboard. God, how she laughed!" The warmth of that memory filled the room, momentarily lifting the heaviness that had settled over them. For a brief moment, it felt as though Eleanor were still with them, her laughter echoing softly in the corners of their minds. But just as quickly as the moment came, it faded, leaving behind a painful emptiness. Harold closed his eyes and whispered, "I'm so tired, Emily. So tired." Emily squeezed his hand tighter, afraid of what his words might mean. "I know, Dad, but you still have me. We're going to get through this together." Harold smiled faintly, but there was a sadness in his eyes that Emily couldn't ignore. "Your mom always said you were the strongest of us," he said softly. She was right. The night grew darker, and the house felt too quiet. Emily stayed close to her father, afraid to leave him alone. She could sense that something had shifted in him, a quiet acceptance settling in his heart. Harold wasn't afraid to join Eleanor when the time came. What frightened him was the idea of leaving Emily behind, knowing how deeply she would feel the loss of both her parents. "Dad," Emily whispered after a long silence, Do you think she knows we're still here with her?" Harold's lips trembled as he fought back more tears. "Oh, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. "I think she's closer to us now than ever before." They sat in silence for a while longer, watching the stars outside twinkle faintly in the night sky. Harold felt the same soft breeze brush against his skin, carrying with it the familiar scent of lavender. It was as if Eleanor was still near, comforting him, reminding him that love doesn't end. It only changes form. "Promise me something, Emily," Harold said suddenly, his voice serious. Emily turned toward him, her brow furrowed. "Anything, Dad. Promise me that when it's my time to go, you won't be sad. Promise me you'll live your life fully, the way your mom would have wanted." Emily's throat tightened, but she nodded. "I promise, Dad. I'll try." Harold smiled, though it was bittersweet. "That's all I ask, sweetheart." As the hours passed, the room seemed to settle into a peaceful stillness. Harold stayed by the window, his hand resting gently on Emily's shoulder as she drifted into a light sleep beside him. His thoughts wandered once more to moments he had shared with Eleanor, moments that felt both distant and vivid, like dreams he could almost touch. He thought of their first dance as husband and wife, swaying clumsily to an old record in the small apartment they rented when they had nothing but each other. He remembered the way Eleanor's eyes sparkled when she laughed, and the sound of her voice singing softly while she cooked dinner. He thought of every kiss, every touch, every whispered word exchanged between them over the years. And he knew with every fiber of his being that he wasn't truly saying goodbye. Not yet. Eleanor was waiting for him, just as she always had. The soft ticking of the clock was the only sound in the room, marking the passing of time. But for Harold, time no longer mattered. All that mattered was love. And love, he knew, was eternal. The night stretched on, and though it felt as if the world outside had come to a halt, Harold knew that this moment was just a pause in their story. There was still more to come. More memories, more moments, even if they were just in his heart. And though Emily slept peacefully beside him, Harold stayed awake, his gaze fixed on the stars. He smiled softly, knowing that one day soon he would join Eleanor. Until then, he would wait, just as she had waited for him. Because some love stories never truly end. They simply continue, chapter by chapter, until the day they are whole again. Harold remained still, his eyes fixed on the stars, as if searching for a sign hidden among them, a signal from Eleanor that everything would be all right. The air outside had grown cooler, but Harold welcomed the chill against his skin. It reminded him that he was still here, still breathing, though every part of him longed to follow Eleanor wherever she had gone. Emily stirred in her light sleep, her head resting against his shoulder. He glanced down at her, his heart both heavy and full at the sight. This is what Eleanor gave me, he thought. A daughter with Eleanor's strength and his stubbornness. A reminder that even though time had taken so much from them, love would always leave something behind. The hours passed slowly. Harold's body ached, every joint stiff from the journey and the weight of grief pressing on his chest. But he refused to leave the window. Somehow, sitting there, gazing into the night, felt like the closest he could get to Eleanor. His hand rested on Emily's, squeezing gently as if to remind her, even in sleep, that he wasn't going anywhere just yet. "I wonder if she can hear me," Harold whispered to himself, though his voice was so soft it barely broke the silence. He tilted his head upward, addressing the stars as if Eleanor were sitting among them. "If you can hear me, Ellie, I miss you already." The breeze shifted, lifting the curtain slightly, and Harold's heart ached with longing. He remembered how Eleanor used to open the windows during storms, just to hear the rain better. She always said the sound of rain was like a lullaby from the sky. He could almost hear her voice now, gentle and soothing, telling him that everything would be all right. The next morning arrived slowly, with the first rays of sunlight creeping into the room. Emily woke with a start, her body stiff from sitting in the same position all night. She rubbed her eyes and looked over at her father, who was still sitting by the window, gazing at the sky as if he hadn't moved an inch. "Dad!" Emily's voice was soft, filled with concern. "Have you been awake all night?" Harold gave a small nod, not tearing his gaze away from the horizon. "Didn't want to miss anything," he whispered, though his voice was hoarse with exhaustion. Emily frowned, her heart aching for him. "Dad, you need to rest. Mom wouldn't want you to." "I know," Harold interrupted gently. I can't let go yet. Not just yet." Emily's chest tightened, but she said nothing. She knew that there were no words that could ease the kind of pain her father was feeling. Grief wasn't something that could be rushed. It had to be carried, step by painful step, until the weight became bearable. "I'll make us some tea," Emily offered quietly, standing and stretching her stiff limbs. "You need something warm." Harold gave a small nod, though his gaze remained fixed on the window. "Tea sounds good," he whispered, though it was clear that his mind was still far away, lost in memories of a life that felt just out of reach. As Emily moved toward the kitchen, Harold leaned his head back against the chair, closing his eyes for the first time in hours. And in that quiet moment, with the warmth of the rising sun on his face, he allowed himself to drift into sleep. He dreamed of Eleanor. In the dream, she was standing by the lake, just as she had the day they first met. Her hair was golden in the sunlight, and she was wearing the yellow dress he had always loved. She smiled at him, her eyes sparkling with the same mischievous light they had carried throughout their life together. "Harold," she called, her voice soft and familiar. "Come on, slowpoke. You're going to miss all the fun." He laughed, a deep, carefree sound he hadn't heard from himself in years, and began running toward her, his heart light and full of joy. But no matter how fast he ran, she remained just out of reach, her laughter echoing like music on the wind. "Wait for me, Ellie," he called, breathless and desperate. "Don't leave without me." Eleanor turned, her smile softening into something more tender. "I'll always wait for you, Harold. Always." And just like that, she was gone, fading into the sunlight like a dream slipping away at dawn. Harold woke with a start, the dream lingering in the corners of his mind like the last notes of a song. For a moment, he forgot where he was. He glanced around the room, disoriented, until his eyes landed on Eleanor's empty bed. And then the weight of reality crashed down on him once more. "She's waiting for me," he whispered to himself, his voice filled with quiet determination. "I know she is." Emily returned a few minutes later with 2 cups of tea, her heart breaking at the sight of her father's weary face. She set the cups down on the small table by the window and knelt beside him, resting her head on his arm. "I had a dream about her," Harold said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "She was by the lake, waiting for me." Emily smiled through her tears. "She'll always be waiting for you, Dad, just like she always did." Harold nodded, his heart full of both sorrow and peace. He knew that the day would come when he would join Eleanor again. But until then, he would carry her memory with him, in every breath, in every heartbeat, in every whispered promise. And though the story seemed to pause here, both Harold and Emily knew that it wasn't truly over. Love like theirs didn't end with goodbyes. It continued, quietly and steadfastly, waiting patiently for the moment when 2 hearts could be reunited once more. Because some stories never really end. They simply wait for the next chapter to begin. The tea sat untouched on the small table by the window. Harold held the cup absently in his hands, feeling the warmth seep into his fingers, but not lifting it to his lips. His gaze remained distant, lost somewhere between the memory of the dream and the reality that weighed heavy on his heart. Emily sat quietly beside him, her presence a silent comfort as she gave her father the space to process his grief in his own time. "Dad," Emily whispered after a long silence, "we can take things one day at a time. You don't have to figure everything out right now." Harold gave a small nod, though his expression was unreadable. "I know, sweetheart, I know." But the truth was, every second without Eleanor felt like an eternity, and the thought of living even one more day without her was almost unbearable. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Each tick felt like a reminder of all the moments that were slipping away, moments he could never get back. Harold clenched his jaw, fighting the wave of sorrow that threatened to consume him. "You know," he said quietly, "I always thought I'd be the first to go. I imagined she'd be the one sitting here, holding my hand and telling me it was okay to let go." Emily swallowed the lump in her throat, her heart breaking for her father. "She was always so strong," she whispered. "But you were, too, Dad. You still are." Harold gave a small, sad smile. "I don't feel very strong right now, kiddo." Emily placed her hand over his, squeezing gently. "That's okay, Dad. You don't have to be strong all the time." The morning light continued to fill the room, bathing everything in a soft, golden glow. Harold finally sipped the tea, though it had grown lukewarm. He didn't mind. It reminded him of the mornings he and Eleanor used to sit together on the porch, sipping tea and watching the sun rise over the lake. She had always been an early riser, claiming the best part of the day was the quiet before the world woke up. "I can still hear her," Harold murmured, almost to himself. "Her voice, her laugh. It's like she's still here." Emily smiled softly. "She'll always be with us, Dad. In every little thing." Harold nodded, though his heart ached with the knowledge that no memory, no matter how cherished, could replace the real thing. He missed the feel of her hand in his, the sound of her voice calling his name, the way she used to hum softly while she cooked dinner. "I spent 70 years with her," Harold whispered. "And now I don't know who I am without her." Emily rested her head on his shoulder, offering silent comfort. "You're still you, Dad, and she's still a part of you that will never change." Harold closed his eyes, savoring the warmth of his daughter's presence. He knew that Emily was right. Eleanor would always be with him, but it didn't make the ache in his heart any easier to bear. Later that day, Harold and Emily began the slow, painful process of sorting through Eleanor's belongings. Each item they touched carried a memory, a fragment of the life they had built together. There was the old sweater Eleanor always wore in the winter, the one Harold used to tease her about because it was so worn and full of holes. There were the books she loved to read, their pages marked with her neat handwriting in the margins. And there was the music box Harold had given her on their first anniversary, the one that still played the soft melody of their favorite song. As they worked, Harold found himself talking to Eleanor, as if she were still in the room with them. "Remember this, Ellie," he whispered, holding up an old photograph. "You made me wear that ridiculous hat at the beach. I looked like a fool." Emily chuckled softly, her heart warmed by the sound of her father's gentle banter with the memory of her mother. She knew that this was his way of coping, of holding on to the love that still filled every corner of their home. When they came across Eleanor's wedding dress, carefully folded in tissue paper, Harold's breath hitched. He ran his fingers over the delicate lace, remembering the way Eleanor had looked on their wedding day, radiant, like a dream come to life. "I promised her forever," Harold whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "And I meant it." Emily knelt beside him, her eyes filled with tears. "You gave her forever, Dad. Every single day you spent with her was part of that promise." Harold nodded, though the weight of his grief was still heavy. He knew that the hardest part wasn't saying goodbye. It was learning how to live without her. But as he held the wedding dress in his hands, he made a silent promise to Eleanor. He would carry her with him in every step he took until the day they were reunited. That night, Harold sat by the window once more, the stars twinkling in the sky like tiny lanterns guiding lost souls home. Emily sat beside him, her hand resting on his arm as they gazed out into the night. "Do you think she's watching over us?" Emily asked softly. Harold smiled, a tear slipping down his cheek. "I know she is." They sat in silence for a while, letting the stillness of the night wrap around them like a comforting embrace. And though the ache of Eleanor's absence was still there, Harold felt a strange sense of peace settle over him, like a quiet understanding that this was not the end. "I think I'll go see the lake tomorrow," Harold said suddenly, his voice filled with quiet determination. "It's where we first met. Feels right to say goodbye there." Emily smiled through her tears. "I'll go with you, Dad. We'll say goodbye together." Harold nodded, his heart full of gratitude for the daughter Eleanor had given him. He knew that the road ahead would not be easy, but he also knew that he was not alone. Emily would be with him, just as Eleanor would always be with both of them, in every breath, in every heartbeat. And as they sat together by the window, watching the stars fade into the early light of dawn, Harold knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter where love would continue to guide them, even in the darkest of nights. Because some stories never truly end. They simply wait patiently for the next chapter to begin. The following morning, Harold rose earlier than usual, his body heavy with both exhaustion and purpose. For the first time since Eleanor's passing, He had somewhere to go, something he needed to do. He stood by the window, watching as the first light of day kissed the horizon, the sky painted with soft hues of pink and gold. Emily entered the room quietly, already dressed. "You ready, Dad?" she asked gently. Harold gave a small nod, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. "I want to see the lake," he whispered. One last time, Emily walked over and rested a hand on his shoulder. "We'll go together." Harold gathered his old coat, the one Eleanor always teased him about for being too thin for cold mornings. He smiled faintly at the memory, her voice still so alive in his mind. "You will catch your death in that coat, Harold. But you never listen, do you?" The journey to the lake was slow but steady. Emily drove while Harold sat quietly in the passenger seat, lost in his thoughts. As they passed familiar streets and landmarks, memories surfaced like waves. Little fragments of a life shared with Eleanor, moments he hadn't thought about in years. He remembered the first time they had taken Emily to the lake as a baby. Eleanor had insisted on packing enough food for an army, though they only stayed for the afternoon. He remembered how Eleanor's laugh had echoed across the water when Harold tried and failed to teach Emily how to fish. And he remembered the quiet evenings, just the two of them, sitting side by side on the dock as the sun set, the world reduced to the simple rhythm of their breathing and the gentle lapping of the water. When they arrived, the lake was exactly as Harold remembered it. The water shimmered in the morning light, and the trees stood tall and proud, their leaves rustling softly in the breeze. It was a place untouched by time, as if waiting for him to return. Harold stepped out of the car, his knees protesting with every movement, but he ignored the pain. Emily stayed close by his side, her hand resting gently on his arm for support. They made their way to the old dock, the wooden planks creaking under their weight. Harold stood at the edge, looking out over the water, his heart full of memories. He could almost see Eleanor standing there, her yellow dress fluttering in the breeze, her smile as radiant as the sun. "I promised her forever," Harold whispered, his voice barely audible. Emily placed a hand on his shoulder, her eyes filled with tears. "And you gave it to her, Dad." Harold smiled, though his heart ached with longing. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the small, worn photograph of their wedding day, the same one he had brought back from the lake house. He held it in his hands for a moment, his fingers tracing the edges, before placing it gently on the surface of the water. The photograph floated for a moment, caught by the breeze, before slowly drifting away. Harold watched as it danced on the surface, carried by the current toward the center of the lake. "Goodbye, Ellie," Harold whispered, his voice filled with both sorrow and peace. "I'll see you soon." Emily wrapped her arm around her father's, offering silent comfort. They stood together in the quiet morning, watching as the photograph drifted farther and farther away until it was nothing more than a distant speck on the water. The drive home was quiet but not heavy. For the first time in days, Harold felt a sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from closure, because he knew that his love for Eleanor would never truly end, but it was a peace that came from acceptance. He knew now that he could carry her with him, in his heart, without being consumed by grief. When they arrived back home, Harold sat once more by the window, watching as the afternoon sun bathed the room in warm light. Emily sat beside him, her presence a steady anchor in the shifting tides of his emotions. "You know, Dad," Emily said softly, "I think Mom will be proud of you." Harold smiled, his heart light with the thought. "I hope so," he whispered. "I really hope so." As the day faded into night, Harold closed his eyes, letting the gentle rhythm of the world lull him into sleep. And in his dreams, Eleanor was waiting for him by the lake, her hand outstretched, her smile as bright as ever. He knew then, with a certainty that went beyond words, that love was not something that could be confined to a lifetime. It was something that stretched across time, waiting patiently for the moment when two souls could reunite. And though Harold's journey was not yet over, he knew that Eleanor would be with him every step of the way, until the day they met again. Because some stories never truly end. They simply wait for the next chapter to begin. The following days drifted by slowly, each one carrying with it a strange mixture of sadness and peace. Harold found himself falling into a quiet routine, sitting by the window every morning with his cup of tea, lost in thought, while Emily busied herself around the house. The absence of Eleanor was palpable, but somehow Harold felt her presence in the smallest things. The scent of lavender lingering in the air, the way the light filtered through the curtains just the way she liked, or the familiar creak of the floorboards she used to tread so often. One afternoon, Harold decided to take a walk through the garden Eleanor had planted years ago. The flowers were still blooming, despite the neglect over the last few weeks. Eleanor had always tended to the garden as if it were a living extension of herself, each plant a reflection of the love she poured into everything. Now, the garden stood as a quiet testament to her life, a reminder of all the beauty she had created in the world. Harold knelt slowly beside one of the rose bushes, wincing as his old knees protested. His fingers brushed over the soft petals, and for a brief moment, he could almost feel Eleanor's hands guiding his, just as she had done the first time they planted those roses together. "You've still got your touch, Ellie," he whispered, a bittersweet smile tugging at his lips. Emily stood by the door, watching her father with a mixture of sadness and admiration. She knew how deeply he was hurting, but she also saw the quiet strength in the way he carried his grief. He wasn't trying to escape the pain. He was learning to live with it one small step at a time. That evening, as Harold sat by the window watching the sunset, Emily joined him with 2 cups of tea. They sat together in comfortable silence, the weight of unspoken emotions hanging in the air between them. "You know, Dad," Emily said softly, "I've been thinking, maybe we could take a trip, just the 2 of us. Go somewhere nice, somewhere Mom would have loved." Harold turned to look at her, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "She'd love that," he whispered. "She always said we needed more adventures." Emily chuckled. She was right about that. They sat in silence for a while longer, watching as the sky turned from gold to deep blue, the first stars beginning to twinkle overhead. Harold's heart ached with the familiar longing for Eleanor, but for the first time the ache felt bearable, like a quiet reminder of the love that would always be with him. The next morning, Harold woke early, feeling a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in weeks. He dressed slowly, choosing the shirt Eleanor had always said made his eyes look brighter. As he buttoned it up, he imagined her standing behind him, teasing him about how slow he was. "At this rate, Harold, the day'll be over before you're dressed." He smiled at the thought, the warmth of her memory filling the room like sunlight. When Emily saw him standing by the door, dressed and ready, she raised an eyebrow. "Where are you off to, old man?" she teased, though there was affection in her voice. Harold smiled, patting his pocket where he had slipped a small photograph of Eleanor. "Thought I'd take one more walk by the lake. It's a good day for a walk, don't you think?" Emily's eyes softened and she nodded. "It's a perfect day, Dad." Harold made his way slowly to the car, his steps steady but deliberate. Emily helped him into the passenger seat, and soon they were driving once again toward the place where so many of their memories were rooted. The lake was just as peaceful as it had been the last time they visited, the water shimmering under the morning sun. Harold walked along the shore, his heart light with the memory of Eleanor by his side. He could almost hear her laughter on the wind, see the way her eyes sparkled when she smiled. He found a quiet spot by the water's edge and sat down, pulling the photograph from his pocket. He held it in his hands for a long moment, tracing the edges with his thumb, before placing it gently on the surface of the water. As the photograph floated away, Harold whispered, "I'll be with you soon, Ellie. Just wait a little longer." Later that night, as Harold lay in bed, a strange sense of peace washed over him. He closed his eyes, his mind drifting toward sleep. And in his dreams, Eleanor was waiting for him, just as she had always promised. She stood by the lake, her hand outstretched, her smile brighter than the stars. "Come on, slowpoke," she called, her voice filled with laughter. "We've got all the time in the world now." Harold reached for her, his heart full of joy, knowing that he had finally found his way back to her. And as their hands touched, everything else faded away, leaving only love, pure and eternal, shining like the first light of a new day. The days after the walk to the lake passed slowly, each one tinged with bittersweet memories. Harold's routine remained the same. Mornings by the window, quiet afternoons in Eleanor's garden, and evenings sipping tea with Emily by his side. Yet, something had shifted in him. It wasn't that the pain of losing Eleanor had disappeared. It never would. But the edges of his sorrow had softened, leaving room for peace to take root. One morning, Harold woke with an idea lingering at the edge of his mind, like a faint melody he couldn't shake. As he sat by the window, watching the sunlight dance across the room, the thought began to take shape. He turned to Emily, who was setting the breakfast table with quiet care. "Emily," Harold said softly, "what do you think about fixing up the old lake house?" Emily blinked, surprised by the question. "The lake house?" she echoed. "Dad, it's been years since anyone's been there." Harold gave a small, nostalgic smile. "Exactly. It's time we went back. Your mom always wanted us to keep it in the family, remember? She used to say it was a place where everything began." Emily's heart swelled with emotion. "You really want to fix it up?" Harold nodded, a spark of determination in his tired eyes. It's what she would have wanted. A week later, Harold and Emily stood outside the lake house, surveying the old building with a mixture of awe and trepidation. The wooden porch sagged slightly, and the paint was chipped and faded, but the essence of the place remained unchanged. It was still the home where Harold and Eleanor had spent countless summers, raising Emily and building a lifetime of memories. "This place needs a lot of work," Emily said with a wry smile, kicking a stray pebble off the porch. Harold chuckled, the sound warm and familiar. "A lot of love, too," he added. "But we've got that in spades." They spent the next few weeks cleaning, painting, and restoring the old house to its former glory. Harold's movements were slow and deliberate, but he worked with a quiet joy, as if every nail hammered and every board replaced was a tribute to Eleanor's memory. Emily stayed by his side, her heart full of both sadness and gratitude. She knew that this project was more than just a renovation. It was Harold's way of keeping Eleanor close, of ensuring that the love they had built would live on. As the days turned into weeks, the lake house began to transform. The garden was replanted with the flowers Eleanor had loved, and the rooms were filled with photographs and mementos from their life together. One evening, after a long day of work, Harold and Emily sat on the newly restored porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "You know, Dad," Emily said softly, "this place feels like her." Harold smiled, his heart light. "She's here," he whispered. "In every corner, every flower, every breath of air." They sat in comfortable silence, the sound of the lake lapping gently against the shore. And for the first time since Eleanor's passing, Harold felt truly at peace. He knew that this place would be a refuge for their family, a place where love could grow and memories could be made for generations to come. One quiet morning, as the first light of dawn touched the water, Harold sat by the lake, his heart full of contentment. He knew that his time was drawing near, but the thought no longer frightened him. He had lived a good life, filled with love and laughter, joy and sorrow. And now, as he gazed across the water, he felt a quiet certainty that Eleanor was waiting for him, just as she always had. Emily joined him on the dock, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "You okay, Dad?" she asked softly. Harold gave a small nod, a peaceful smile on his face. "I'm ready," he whispered. Emily's heart ached, but she knew that her father's journey was coming to its natural end. "I'll be with you, Dad," she promised. Every step of the way, Harold reached into his pocket and pulled out the small photograph of Eleanor, the edges worn from years of being held and cherished. He kissed it softly before placing it on the surface of the water, watching as it drifted away. "See you soon, Ellie," he whispered. "I'm coming home." That night, as Harold lay in bed, his breathing slow and steady, he felt a warmth spread through him, a feeling of love so pure and encompassing that it brought tears to his eyes. And then, in the quiet darkness, he saw her. Eleanor stood at the edge of the lake, her yellow dress fluttering in the breeze, her smile radiant and bright. She held out her hand to him, her eyes filled with joy and love. "Come on, Slowpoke," she called, her voice like music. "We've got all the time in the world now." Harold smiled, his heart full and at peace. He reached for her hand, feeling her warmth and love envelop him like a comforting embrace. And in that moment, he knew that he was home. As Harold's hand slipped gently from Emily's grasp, a peaceful smile remained on his face. A final gift from the man who had loved deeply, lived fully, and found his way back to the one who had been waiting for him all along. And though the chapter of Harold's life had come to an end, the story of their love would live on. In every sunset over the lake, in every breeze that carried the scent of lavender, and in the hearts of those who knew the beauty of a love that never truly ends. Because some stories don't end, they simply wait patiently for the next chapter to begin. The morning after Harold's peaceful passing, Emily sat alone on the porch of the lake house, watching the mist roll off the water. The world felt different now. Quieter, softer, as if it was acknowledging the absence of the man who had loved so deeply and lived so fully. Harold had left in the way he had always hoped, peacefully, with a smile on his face, as if Eleanor had come to take him home. Emily felt a bittersweet ache in her chest. It hurt to say goodbye, but knowing that her parents were together again brought a strange sense of comfort. She glanced down at the small leather-bound notebook resting on her lap. It was Harold's journal, filled with years of thoughts, memories, and love letters to Eleanor. He had written to her every day since the moment they met, even long after she had passed, his words a testament to a love that knew no boundaries. With trembling hands, Emily opened the journal to the last entry, written just days before Harold's passing. "My dearest Ellie," the entry began, "the days feel longer without you, but I find comfort in the thought that we'll be together soon. I see you in everything, in the sunrise and the breeze, and in the quiet moments by the lake. I promise you forever, and I'm almost there, my love. Just a little longer. Wait for me." Emily traced the words with her fingers, tears slipping down her cheeks. Her father had lived his life with unwavering love, and even in his final moments, that love had never faltered. She closed the journal gently, holding it close to her heart. "I'll make sure your love story lives on, Dad," Emily whispered. "I promise." Over the next few weeks, Emily stayed at the lake house, tending to the garden and restoring the little things Harold hadn't finished. Each task felt like a way to honor her parents, as if keeping the house alive meant keeping them close. She planted new flowers in the garden, just as Eleanor would have, and framed some of Harold's handwritten letters to hang on the walls. Visitors began to arrive, family members and old friends who had heard about Harold's passing. They sat with Emily on the porch, sharing stories of the man who had touched so many lives. They spoke of Harold's kindness, his stubbornness, and the way his love for Eleanor had been like a beacon, guiding him through life's darkest moments. Emily listened to each story with a smile, feeling her heart swell with pride and gratitude. Her parents' love had been more than just a private story. It had become a source of inspiration for everyone who knew them. One evening, as Emily sat alone by the lake, a thought began to take root in her mind. She had spent her whole life watching her parents live with love and purpose, and now it was her turn. The lake house, the garden, the memories, they weren't just relics of the past. They were gifts for the future, reminders of what mattered most. Emily stood and made her way back to the house, her heart light with a newfound sense of purpose. She knew what she needed to do. The following month, the lake house became more than just a place to honor the past. It became a sanctuary for those seeking comfort and healing. Emily opened it to families in need of peace, offering them a place to rest, reflect, and reconnect with what truly mattered. She called it Eleanor's Haven, a tribute to the woman who had taught her that love could heal even the deepest wounds. The garden flourished under Emily's care, each bloom a reminder of Eleanor's touch. The house filled with laughter, tears, and stories, just as it had during Harold and Eleanor's lifetime. And through it all, Emily felt their presence. Quiet but constant, like the breeze that stirred the trees or the sunlight that danced on the water. She knew that her parents were still with her, guiding her every step of the way. Years passed and Emily grew older, her life filled with meaning and purpose. She never married, but she found joy in the relationships she built with the people who came to Eleanor's haven. Each visitor became part of the house's story, their lives forever touched by the legacy of love Harold and Eleanor had left behind. On quiet evenings, Emily would sit by the lake, gazing at the water as the stars began to appear. And in those moments, she felt closest to her parents, felt their love wrapping around her like a warm embrace. "Thank you," she would whisper into the night, her voice carried by the wind, "for everything." And somewhere in the quiet beyond the stars, Harold and Eleanor were smiling, their hands intertwined, their love shining brighter than ever. As the years went by, the lake house continued to bloom under Emily's care, becoming a refuge for many. But time, relentless as always, left its mark on her. Emily's hair turned silver, and her steps grew slower, but her heart remained full. Every flower in the garden, every ripple on the lake, felt like a message from her parents, reminding her that love never truly fades. One autumn evening, as the leaves began to fall and the air carried the first chill of the season, Emily sat on the porch, wrapped in a soft blanket. She gazed out over the lake, the water still and calm under the fading light of the setting sun. A sense of peace washed over her, but also a gentle sadness, an acknowledgement that her own journey was nearing its end. She took a deep breath, her eyes misting with tears. "I hope I made you proud, Mom. Dad," she whispered into the evening air. "I did my best." As the sky darkened, Emily slowly stood, her body tired but her spirit light. She made her way to the dock and sat at the edge, just as she had done countless times before. The stars began to appear one by one, reflecting softly on the surface of the lake. And then in the quiet stillness of the night, she felt it, a breeze, carrying the familiar scent of lavender, wrapping around her like an embrace. Her heart skipped a beat, and a smile broke through her tears. "You're here," she whispered, knowing that Harold and Eleanor were with her, just as they always had been. The stars above shimmered, as if answering her. And for the first time in years, Emily felt ready to follow wherever the love of her parents would lead. With a heart full of gratitude, she whispered her last words into the night. "I'll see you soon." The next morning, when the neighbors arrived to bring her flowers, they found Emily sitting peacefully on the dock, her hands resting gently on her lap, her face calm and serene, just like her father's had been the day he joined Eleanor. She had slipped away quietly in the night, carried by the love that had guided her through every moment of her life. The house remained still, but the love within it endured, echoing through the flowers in the garden, the breeze on the lake, and the laughter of every family who would one day pass through Eleanor's haven. And though Emily was gone, her story, their story, was far from over, because some love stories never really end. They continue, quietly and patiently, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of the power of love and memory, we invite you to join us. Subscribe to stay connected with more stories that show that even in the hardest moments, love can shine through. Because in every ending, there's always a new beginning waiting to be written.